are talking about the history of Black medicine ways with Sade, the founder of Roots of Resistance, an educational project that seeks to help folks reclaim healing ways interrupted by colonization. Roots of Resistance operates under the belief that bodily autonomy and culturally relevant medical care are essential to liberation, and that learning to heal ourselves is a liberatory praxis of self-determination and resistance. Roots of Resistance is dedicated to helping historically looted communities advocate for their well-being, access quality healthcare, and to find alternatives if Western healing models fail them. All right, so tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and where you're coming from and why you're so passionate.
Okay, well, growing up in the socioeconomic bracket that I did, there was a lot of exposure to chemicals and other pollutants, as well as economic and racial stress that exacerbated a lot of health problems in my family. And my family wasn't the only people experiencing this. This was definitely a community-wide problem that I saw as I grew up. And so that kind of oriented me towards health. And initially I wanted to be a medical doctor, naturopathic medical doctor specifically, but it wasn't really financially accessible. If you go into allopathic medicine, you can get access to some programs that'll help relieve some of the debt, but that really wasn't the type of philosophy I wanted to apply. Naturopathic is more in line with my culture, which turns out to be African culture. The African philosophy of healing tends to be more whole body and holistic. And so I think that's why I was initially drawn to naturopathic medicine, but $300,000 in loans kind of made it to where I wouldn't have the luxury to treat my own community.
Right.
I would end up in sports clinics and in very wealthy communities, working for them, trying to pay back my loans. So while I was doing my pre-med, I ended up getting wooed by lab research, because when you go to grad school in order to study research, they pay you. So instead of graduating with a bunch of debt, you work for 6 or 7 years at a McDonald's manager wage, but you still are paid. Right. It's a very big difference. And while I was there, I thought I would be able to contribute to the body of medical knowledge. I was working in foodborne pathogens. I was working in antimicrobial resistance. And I experienced a lot of abuse while I was there. There were not a lot of people that looked like me or had my background. And there's definitely an academic hazing that happens in this field. And so I thought I could deal with it in order to kind of represent the interests of my people. There's a lot of times where things that only affect Black people or Black women aren't really addressed in research. Like the vaccine for HPV, it only addresses the viruses that tend to affect non-Black people. And we tend to have another set of viruses that are prevalent among us, and the vaccine doesn't work as well on those, right? Wow. And you do get some variation among people, but among different races, you tend to have certain conditions that are more prevalent.
I did not know that. I did not know that. Now I'm rethinking, oh goodness.
So I thought, and lupus, for example, primarily affects Black women, and there hasn't really been much advancement in terms of treatment because that's not a real high priority. And I thought my presence there would, kind of help fix that problem.
Move the needle a little further.
But how science works is you spend your whole life contributing this much to the body of science. And every little bit counts, but it really was not fast enough given the urgency that I saw in my communities. People around me were getting sicker and sicker and dying, and it was just taking too long. So I felt the work I was doing was valuable, but not applicable with the sense of urgency that I felt. So I ended up going back to studying botany and nutrition and herbalism and other modalities that I felt like I could apply more immediately to people in my community. And I had been doing culinary and nutrition classes for quite a while, and I was able to see the impact that I could have on people, teaching them, how to cook their own food, how to ease some of the symptoms of conditions that they might be having with a diet that was appropriate.
Right.
And so that's the work that I had already been doing. And as I began studying herbalism in earnest, I was able to add that to my curriculum that I could then offer to people. But the interesting thing is, when I found myself in all these herbal spaces as I'm taking my studies in that area more seriously, I find myself in very white spaces. Sometimes I'm in brown spaces, Latinx spaces, but no matter where I was, I didn't see myself reflected. I never heard of the medicine that Africans use, whether throughout the diaspora in Brazil, in the islands, in the United States, or in the continent. And I found this really curious. I knew better. I knew that we had medicine, but I never heard of it. And there were times where I just got really suspicious of the things that were being told to me.
Right.
Like, for example, I heard about cotton root bark being used, cotton root and cotton root bark being used for abortion, like being used as an abortifactant and for menstrual regulation. But I was just kind of like, that's so strange that no one ever mentions whether enslaved Black people used it or not for those reasons, because they work so intimately with cotton and they would have had a great need for those types of medicines. Right. And I do a little research, and it turns out that Africans had been using cotton in the continent before they were enslaved to grow cotton. So even if it wasn't a medicine that originated in Africa, like, I at least wanted people to mention how and if they used it when it was introduced to them, possibly later. So yeah, like, these types of suspicions that I had turned out to be valid, and I continued to push my research farther, and I uncovered so much stuff that I can't keep it to myself, and so now I speak regularly about it.
Yes, it's beautiful. We need someone to be the voice, because I say all the time, like, I'm very uneducated about herbalism and where our medicines come from. And I think it's very important for people like you to just advocate and educate, like, our population and the masses about these things. So let's go into Afrobotany, because I know it's something that a term that a lot of people aren't familiar with. Yeah. So can you just kind of explain the breakdown of the word and,
Okay. Well, first I want to say that I didn't originate this term. I've heard it used around, but because African healing ways are not acknowledged very often, you rarely hear the word. So botany is the study of plants. Ethnobotany is the study of how different ethnic groups used plants, whether it's food, medicine, dyes, making houses. It's just how they use plants, period. And then Afrobotany or Afroethnobotany would be about how African people use plants in various ways. And I tend to focus on how they use them as medicine, but the other areas interest me as well.
Right. So how has Black healing ways been appropriated by the masses, like, considering... Oh, this is going to be a good answer.
Let me finish you. Considering, yes.
Just considering, like, our history and our ancestry and our contributions.
I guess what I would ask is, like, how haven't they been?
Right.
So the medicine that we practice now in the Americas, in the different areas that we were dropped off, is now a hybrid medicine. Because we did have influences before we came to the Americas, because we were not closed cultures. We shared with each other, with other Africans, because there were many African healing cultures brought over, many African people, and we were all mixed together and constantly moved back and forth to different territories, different colonies. And then we also were in contact with Asians, different types of Asians. We were in contact with Arabs, we were in contact with Europeans. So even before we came here, we were learning from each other. The dynamics were not always lateral and were not always equal. Sometimes it was because we were being enslaved by Arabs or Indians or Chinese people. But when we came to the Americas, depending on who brought us here, whether it was the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the English, the Portuguese, we had a variety of influence on each other. And it wasn't equal. It wasn't equal. The reason being that the territories or the geographies, the types of places that Africans were brought from were more similar to the types of places that Europeans brought us in the Americas. It's like, which is a subtropical or tropical area? England or West Africa?
Definitely not England.
Yeah. So I was like, of the people that came to the New World, Africans, no matter where in Africa we were brought from, we were better equipped to survive in this New World. But it's not that we didn't struggle. We just didn't struggle as much as the people that brought us here. We also had more positive points of contact with the natives that were already here. There were so many times where they would offer refuge to us. They had entire towns. It's not like, they didn't have civilizations. They had civilizations that welcomed us in. We were intermarried. We fought wars together against the colonists. So we had plenty of time to exchange. Everything wasn't the same throughout all parts of the Americas. There were some areas, such as in the Caribbean, where the native population was decimated a little bit more. And so even though they were still there, they still exist. Africans became the dominant people. And I would say, I really don't like this word, but they did become kind of stewards of the land and the medicine ways that evolved as a result represented Native American medicine from that area. So it was a hybrid of Native American and African medicine. But those Caribbean people weren't stagnant. They were spread throughout the Americas. Right. Like after the Haitian Revolution, even though people were supposed to get freed, human contraband, the Haitians, were brought by the planters as they set up shop in Louisiana and other places, and they continued their illicit practice of enslavement. So, I'm trying to make the point that there was like all this rich history of healing ways that Africans collected in the hybrid medicine ways that they created. And because they didn't have a choice, they were constantly exposed to Europeans. Now, if we mostly focus on the British colony, which is what America was, the Americans, the British colonists that later became the Americans, they made it a regular practice to observe what we did to heal ourselves. Because remember, they didn't have very much access to Native Americans, and their medicine wasn't working. And the medicines that they had in Europe that did work were very expensive to import. So they needed to...
Because they were importing them from...
Plus also they had declared independence, and they were trying to separate themselves from the old world. But it was so expensive. It was so expensive to import things in. You couldn't just ship it on a plane like you would back in the day.
Day boat ride.
Yeah.
6 month boat ride.
So they really wanted to know the local flora, and we had that information. Native Americans had that information too, but they didn't have as much access to them. There's so many stories over and over again where they try to bribe a native, or they try to pay them so that they could give over their recipes and their knowledge, and they were like, you can hire me as a doctor, but I'm not giving you my recipes.
They were smart. They were really smart.
We did the same thing. So I've literally read accounts where they would poison the people that they enslaved and then follow them into the woods to see what they collected, and they write it down and they publish it in their little books and distribute it to...
We did that?
No, it was not us. It was what slaveholders did.
Okay,
slaveholders would poison us.
Oh, wow.
They would poison the people that they enslaved and then follow them into the woods and write down what they collected.
Wow.
Yes, that type of stuff happened.
Wow.
There would be times where they would put black women, older black women who could no longer work in the fields the same way, in charge of the on-site hospitals, or they would be in charge of the health of everybody in the slave quarters, and if people died, they would be punished.
Wow.
Yeah, so there were so many opportunities for slave-holding whites, which would be considered the elite class, to observe Africans and absorb their medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
Like they had countless opportunities, and we know this because they wrote it down in the little letters that they wrote to each other, basically like the plantation equivalent of email. They were like, oh, guess what I learned from my Negro today, right? So we have that documentation. We also have books, medical journals that they wrote. The recipes that they recorded then were disseminated into newspapers that the average white person read. And then also, there were things that they were not privy to, that they didn't immediately know about because they didn't have the same access to black people that poor white people did. So poor white people and enslaved black people, even though there was still division amongst them for a lot of reasons, there was a little bit more cultural exchange, right?
That's really interesting. Because they were like the lower,
and we communicated with each other more often. Like the overseer, even though he was up here and he was doing what he was doing, he was still in closer contact with the people in the field than the person in the big house.
Of course.
Right?
Of course, yeah.
And the men who got the credit for all of these medicines, they had even less contact because it was the mistress that would do the majority of the nursing. So maybe she didn't do the dirty work and handle that person, but she would be managing the plantation, and she would be guiding the black women that were doing all the actual work. And so she would say, okay, well, what kind of remedy are you going to use? And she would approve over everything. And then she would write down in her little lady's journal all the recipes that she saw them use, or she would talk to other mistresses and be like, oh, well, over at this plantation, they use this, so I want you to use this. And in that way, Southern medicine, which later became Western white medicine, which later became our medical system, was able to flourish because not only were they able to draw from African medicine, which in this context was a hybrid medicine that also drew from Native American medicine, they had so many bodies to experiment on. So you could really use this recipe or this remedy that you heard about over and over and over and over again and do a trial run, a clinical study with all of these bodies that you had access to. So it really wasn't that hard for them to appropriate African medicine. What was hard was for them to erase that they appropriated it, and that only happened recently.
So